Thank you. Good morning to everyone who is logging in. I know we have a large number of folks who have registered. And as folks are logging in, we're going to give you about a minute or two to get yourself set up, test your audio, make sure you're okay. And then we're going to get started because there's lots of information to share today. So we'll start in about 2 minutes.
Uh, Hello, Talana, Nika. I went over to the room next door and I told the parent there that I'm having a webinar conference call, and
Mhm.
I suggest to her the boy needs a place to calm down. He could do that in the third floor conference room where it is available. Because he's making a lot of noise. He's making a lot of noise.
Just a
Oh,
prayer that we're live, Godfrey.
yep.
Okay.
Are we live? We're not
Yes,
live yet, right?
we
Okay,
are.
thank you. All right, let me mute.
And so to the folks who are coming in, we're about to start in about 1 minute. And so we're just letting people kind of come on in the room. And we're going to get started in 1 minute because we do have a lot of information to share.
Hi, Talana. Your audio sounds a bit off. I'm not sure if it's your microphone.
Okay, just adjusted. Is this better?
Yes,
Okay, thank you.
you're welcome.
All right, Godfrey. I see the numbers stop going up really fast. So why don't we go ahead and start? Do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for participating in this morning's webinar, Culturally Responsive Family Engagement, a very interesting and important topic. My name is Godfrey Rivera. I'm the parent trainer at the Metropolitan Parent Center in New York City. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. And Godfrey will, if he likes to, put some accents on points that I make. And so you may hear him present in different ways if he has some thoughts to share with you. So just a heads up for everyone. And they are always welcomed. So my name is Talana Jones. I am a parent of a child with Down syndrome who is 15 years old. He received early intervention in both New York City and in Syracuse. I am coming to you guys from Syracuse, New York today. And I'm here to talk to you about culturally responsive family engagement. Normally, when we talk about culturally responsiveness, we don't always talk about how we can engage families in this way. So I'm really excited to bring this topic to you. Thanks to Sinergia for allowing me to do these webinars and really share with families this information. Last week, we talked about having a vision for your child. Tuesday, we talked about utilizing your voice and how to put it forth towards advocacy efforts and how to develop leadership in families. And today we're going to talk about, so what does that look like when we are culturally responsive, both families and practitioners? What can we bring to the table? Oh, here. And so, welcome. I'm so excited for everybody who has participated and taken some time out of their day to come and listen to me talk. We are going to do a quick overview of what is culturally responsiveness, what is cultural responsiveness, an intersection of race and ethnicity, as well as disability, some of the challenges and how can we get past that. What does cultural responsiveness mean for families? What does it mean for professionals? And then hopefully, if we still have time, some Q&A. If you do have questions while the webinar is going on, please type them into the chat box. We will do our best to answer them during the Q&A process. If we do not get to all of the questions or you have a question afterwards, please feel free to send an email to Sinergia, and we'll try to send out a Word document to all registered attendees with the answers to your questions if we have a lot that we can address. on this webinar today. I am Talana. I know it looks like it's pronounced Talina, but it's Talana. I am the one in the upper corner. That is my son in all of the pictures, Kareem Tajay. That's his dad and my niece. That is my family. And he is the reason why I do the things that I do. We have on our Syracuse orange in that top left, even though Brooklyn, New York, born and raised. So before we begin, this is a self-reflective webinar. Because there are no quick and simple solutions, no single program or package intervention to train professionals on how to connect with culturally diverse families, the issue of reflection becomes critically important. Any attempt to generate tricks of the trade must be avoided because of the complexity of the issue and because of the individual needs, motivations, experiences, and abilities of children of color. This is not a quick fix. This is the start to a long conversation and a complex conversation. And really, this is just to get our toes wet because we only have an hour today. So I just want you to keep this in mind as we go through the next set of slides, because this really is how you see yourself being culturally responsive, whether you're a family, a person who has a child with a disability, or a professional who works with families who have children with disabilities. So what is it? What is cultural responsiveness? The National Education Association defines cultural competence as having an awareness of one's own cultural identity and views about difference, and the ability to learn and build on the varying cultural community norms of students and their families. It is this ability to understand the within-group differences that make each student unique while celebrating the between-group variations that make our world a tapestry. It's a very flowery definition, but I love that it starts with, once again, one's own cultural identity. That self-reflection piece is something that you're going to see as a theme throughout this webinar. I do like to make sure that Black feminist thought is centered in my work, and so we cannot talk about the language of cultural responsiveness without highlighting that Dr. Gloria Ladson Billings, in her 1994 book, The Dream Keeper, wrote about culturally responsive practice and practitioners. And what does that look like? She often is also credited with this idea that instead of the achievement gap, we need to talk about an educational debt, right? And so not that children who are of color and who have disabilities have failed. They themselves have not failed. They receive failing scores, but what is it that was in the way of them succeeding, right? So not investing in our schools, not investing in professional development, not investing in our children's goals and outcomes. It's the educational debt is something that we owe them. And so I have to center her if I'm going to talk about this before we move on. And she talks about the communication of high expectations, active teaching methods, a practitioner as facilitator, inclusion of culturally and linguistically diverse students, cultural sensitivity, reshaping the curriculum or delivery of services. That number 6 is so key, because if we do not reshape curriculum, we tend to repeat ourselves and we instill what we already know, the status quo, into our future young people. Student controlled discourse and small group instruction. And so cultural responsiveness, like the term cultural competence, promotes an understanding of ethnicity. I think the key here is that we're used to the language of cultural competence. People use that a lot. What responsiveness has us do is just make sure that we're not talking about being perfect. You're not going to know every single thing about everyone's culture, but it assumes that you have this openness to adapt to the needs of those you work with. And cultural responsiveness really has you understand your own culture, sit there and reflect on your background. So, as we see, the essential elements of cultural responsiveness is a recognition of one's own cultural lens and biases. So it's not just that we're looking at our culture and where things come from, but if you're a person who is from a 2-family home, you lived in a really nice area, you had dinner every single night, you had time to do your homework, and then, went to sleep and had that very set schedule. If you're engaging with families who don't necessarily, their family structure is not the same, or they don't have those kinds of set schedules. What is it that we think about those families that don't necessarily look like what we understood to be a good practice in our own family, right? Or if you had a tough time in your life and you think about those stories, how has that created a bias against whether or not you want to actually have someone help you, or if you want to talk to the school? If you had a tough time in school, you can see how a parent may never want to step foot in a school again if school wasn't the place that they had the best time in. And so it's important to recognize our own stories, our own experiences, and how that colors how we see the world. Of course, knowledge of students' cultural backgrounds, you have to be able to know where children are from, which means that you have to build relationships with them. Awareness of the broader social, economic, and political context, the climate of the world that's around us. We do not exist in a bubble. Even if we reflect on our own culture, we also understand that things are happening all around us that will impact our lives. And so the ability and willingness to use culturally appropriate management strategies. So you have to want to do it, right? So you have to have the ability to do it, but you also have to want to. You're willing, you're committed to doing it. And as I said, commitment to building a caring classroom community. These are all things that situate itself directly within the person. And that's how you move on to this idea of cultural responsiveness. Again, journey, right? Not a place that you arrive, but continuously ongoing. This is a lot. This is a lot of words. But I like to just make sure that, folks are steeped in, um, because it's not mine. Yes, it's not something I made up. But that there has been a lot of research done on culturally responsive lenses. And so again, you see Gloria Ladson Billings is once again all over the place here. And she talks about this nuanced, reflective, and critical consciousness about race, power, and privilege in society. We cannot talk about our families of color who have children with disabilities without talking about how their race, their ethnicity impacts their life. We cannot talk about having partnerships as families and professionals if we're not going to acknowledge that when families walk in the room that there might feel like there's a power differential, that folks who actually work for schools or folks that actually work for early intervention or OPWDD, that they don't have this sense, not you as a person, I want to be clear about that, that there's not a sense that power lies somewhere else and not necessarily with the families. With those of us who do webinars and share information with families, remind folks, and what I've done in the last two webinars is really situate the fact that families' voice is power and is powerful, and makes them equal players at the table. But that is something that we have to learn as we go on and be reminded of. So it's just something to continue to think about if you're a professional at the table, that those dynamics exist. And of course, privilege, depending on your education level, your socioeconomic status. Again, whether you have a two-family home, people treat me very differently now that I'm a single mom. Versus when I walked into a room as a married woman. And so it's very interesting to see how I am engaged as a family right now. And it's interesting to see, but there was a privilege in being married in those moments. And I recognize that. So again, always being self-reflective. But a culturally responsive lens through which deficit-oriented beliefs, so how we think about people, how we think about our kids, how we think about the adults around us, it challenges systems, policies, and people when you have that type of lens. It ensures that all differences are embraced. It ensures that high expectations are set for students regardless of their background. And it requires students to provide protective factors. So really think about what are the barriers that are in the way and how can you mitigate them. And again, for the goal of achievement in academics and in their life, to have quality programming. And so what are these habits that you can develop, right? I like to give people questions because I say time and time again, I don't have the answer to anything. My goal is to share information, have you reflect, See if you can use a piece here or there in your practice, in your world, especially the families. Think about how you can ask some of these questions of the people who are working with you. And for practitioners, how can you utilize this question for yourself and your colleagues? So problem identification, when a child is acting up or a family is not necessarily communicating the way you want to, or just any challenge that arrives, what the question, like, what is happening here? Are there some cultural implications? What beliefs, policies, and practices have led to the problem? And so how can we, have I done something, right? I think is really important. It's a really important question. What has worked and what's not worked? So if you say you tried to reach out to the parent, you can throw up your hands and say, well, I tried to call them 100 times. They never pick up the phone. Reflection says, I've done all that I can do. Maybe not, right? Maybe you can send an email because that family is used to communicating via text and email. They're not really into picking up the phone and having conversations. They change their phone number too much. Or it may need to be that you see them in person and you go do a home visit, So how can you take that next step to connect with folks? How is another cultural perspective likely to offer a different mediating guidelines for behavior and individual choices? So I talk about that in terms of behavior and how sometimes I remember explicitly when people wanted to give Tajay, that's my son's name, food for when he does things well. And that was super problematic for me as a plus size woman who wanted him to make better food choices. And I just, I had to share with them that culturally my own habits around food and whatnot are such that they couldn't do those things. So how can our interpretation of different things impact the choices that we make? And so in sharing that, they chose some other options. But again, these are kinds of the things that play out in the background. And can you validate your assessments? What perspectives of sources or information inform problem identification? So was it just your assessment, or can you think about how else other people might have viewed the same situation? And can you garner more information from that in order to help fix it, right? The reason. And so, of course, you go back and forth between these, but these are kinds of the thinking that you do when you're trying to solve a problem or looking at an issue through a culturally responsive lens. Of course, the strategies are very much about who you are, what you teach, and how you interact with students, families, and the community. I put relationships in parentheses because it is the driver, it is the most important thing. But I think this is something that we don't think about very often, but how you as professionals advocate for your students. For families, we tell them all the time, you are your child's first advocate and you need to continue to advocate. But I have to tell you, some of my longest relationships with providers have been the ones who advocated for Tajay when I didn't know what I didn't know. And so they spoke about things that were supposed to happen and they spoke up, right? And that was really important because not only strengthened our relationship between my family and them as an educator or a provider, but it also let me know that they actually cared about his educational outcomes. They cared about his outcomes for his life. And so that was really important. And we need to think about ourselves when we're professionals as advocates for our students. Sometimes people tell us not to do that. I disagree wholeheartedly. How you do it is definitely one of, a issue of nuance. So I mentioned this early on, but discussing the elephant in the room, what happens when we're not culturally responsive. I don't know if you see the elephant, he's on the therapy couch and he says, I'm right here in the room and no one even acknowledges me. I thought that was pretty funny. So our educational system has disproportionate negative impacts on particular families. Students of color, particularly Black and Latino students, students of low socioeconomic backgrounds, our LGBTQ students, and our students with disabilities. There are any number of those that can intersect with one another, and that only adds to the impact on them. So if you're a Black or Latino family who has a disability and you are also poor, you can imagine that your experience oftentimes in the educational system is not one of the most pleasant. As we move further into this, we will talk a bit about um, the impact and what that could look like. We will also talk about the fact that New York City just had an interesting article that came out about early intervention and the numbers and this notion of underserviced children who are both Black and Latino with disabilities. And it was it was really it was really alarming, the numbers. I didn't have it to put in this report because they took it from a larger study that was put out by early intervention. But I think it's important that if you get a chance to check it out, you should, because it had a lot of great information. So what's disproportionality? What do we mean when we say disproportionate? So there's oftentimes we hear overrepresentation, and I know I hear this a lot, overrepresentation of a specific group in special education programs or disciplinary outcomes relative to the presence of the group in the overall student population. So we know that students are oftentimes Black and Latino students, especially students with disabilities who are of color, are disproportionately overrepresented in our numbers when it comes to suspension. They are um, disproportionately overrepresented in special education in general. And we often hear research talk about the fact that sometimes they are over identified or they're misidentified. And for many of us, this conversation happens a lot, right? That students of color get misidentified or over identified the moment that they have a behavior. We want to classify them as having a disability according to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA. And research has talked about the fact that we have too many Black and brown children in special education. For those of us who are families who actually have children with disabilities, who have a diagnosis or have a developmental delay, I said to myself, because I didn't know that this underrepresentation piece was there. And so this was really important for me to see when I first learned about disproportionality, because I said to myself, what I see more happening is I know families who have children with disabilities and they're not getting services, or they're not getting services at the level that they're supposed to get services. And I know it's an individualized plan, but if you're Black and you have a child with autism and you're not receiving speech therapy or occupational therapy, or you can't even get your child classified as anything because you have to go to a developmental pediatrician that is in a particular neighborhood that there might be a wait for, and does someone accept Medicaid, all of these things, right? Or does someone accept the type of insurance you have? And what does that mean? Can you even get there? Your transportation, those issues come up. And I'm like, and they can't even get a classification. So, everybody can't be misidentified or over identified. There are many of us who are looking for identification and we realize we're being underserviced. So, this underrepresentation piece is so critical. So critical. If one of those key points you walk away with in a webinar, this is one of them. The underrepresentation of a specific group in accessing intervention services, resources, programs, rigorous curriculum and instruction relative to the presence of this group in the overall population. So if there's only 17% of students here, for example, in Syracuse, who our district is pretty diverse. But we were finding that if African American students and Latino students maybe made up 30% of the students that we served here, they were accounting for 80% of the students who were being suspended, right, at one time in this city. And that was particularly students of color with disabilities. And so that's this idea of being overrepresented in one area. But when we looked at how many services people were getting, all of a sudden we recognized very quickly that they did not have as many services as their white counterparts, regardless of their socioeconomic status. And so that was a pause. That was something for people to think about and figure out, well, what else can we do? What's going on? What is getting in the way of accessing those interventions and services? And so that led us to other kinds of conversations. And as I mentioned, underrepresentation is often the issue for families of color, both in early intervention and in special education. I want to take a second to talk about disability as a culture, because I talked about the intersections of race and disability, but I don't think when we speak about cultural representation or cultural responsiveness that we think about disability itself as a culture. And I just wanted to be able to mention that because I think that's really important for us to think about. Stephen E. Brown, he is the co-founder of the Institute on Disability Culture, describes it as a group that has a forged identity, right? They share a common history of oppression and a common bond of resilience. People with disabilities generate art, music, literature, and other expressions. And so their culture essentially comes from their lived experience as a person with a disability. So most importantly, and I love this piece, we are proud of ourselves as folks with disabilities. We claim our disabilities with pride and as part of our identity. I continue to remind families that disability is a culture, and it is a culture that our children now belong to, because often if we only see disability as a stigma, if we only see disability as problematic or as a thing to be fixed, we will always have a negative relationship with it. And it doesn't have to be like that. Just like our race and our ethnicity and our gender expression all kind of come together to create this rich tapestry of who we are as human beings, then we can include disability in that as well and have that be a very rich part of who our children are. And I think that's really important to have these kinds of healthy relationships to the multiple identities that we all hold. My son Tajay having Down syndrome, I couldn't even imagine him without it, right? And I know for some people that's hard depending on the diagnosis that you have, or if your child has a developmental delay or some serious behavior issues and challenges, that's hard to look at through that lens. So I want to be mindful of that as well. Again, it's a journey to get there. You know what I mean? But it is still very much a part of who they are. And so while we wish sometimes our children had it easier or different, in the same way, those of us who are not rich wish we had access to more resources and money. It is one of those things that I hope that we can see in this light as part of this larger identity piece. So what are some of the challenges? I mentioned stigma before. We know that once you get labeled, people have low expectations, if any expectations at all, of your ability to achieve. And so that includes race. So even if you didn't have a disability, we know that the research has showed time and time again that folks look at people who do not speak English as a first language here in this country, and children who are African American and Latino as children who they have set the bar lower for. Add to that disability, and that goes down even lower. And so the intersection of the two means that there are some serious hurdles to jump over in terms of expectations. Language barriers, and I use language in general. It's just not the language that you speak. So if you speak Spanish, Chinese, or something else, but it is also your ability to communicate in general. So if you're a person who also has communication issues, that is included in language. Or if you're a person who uses ASL as a form of communication and can never find anyone to interpret or use ASL with you, those are the kinds of barriers that happen. And we also know that in communities of color, those access to resources around ASL, different ways of communication, also decrease. Did you have something to say, Godfrey?
Yes, I just wanted to add something about this issue that you're talking about, language.
Mhm.
Our parent center works with a lot of families and parents that come from Latino cultures in the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. And yes, many of them come in not having English language speaking skills. But as you're indicating, it's much deeper than that because everyone who comes to this country brings along their culture, their understanding, their beliefs, their attitudes, and they come into the United States, whether it's New York City or other major cities, with their culture and not understanding how the American culture functions. For example, when I address this issue with the parents, I talk to them about having an understanding of the school culture. That means our children are supposed to sit quietly, work independently, raise their hands, line up, things that they just don't understand because it's not part of their culture, and it's really difficult for them to develop a bridge or where they can have an understanding of these issues. Basically, in my experience as a special educator, bilingual special educator, one of the toughest issues that I've dealt with is addressing the underlying beliefs and attitudes from both sides, the main culture here in the U.S. and the culture that the parents bring into. It creates, as you were indicating, many challenges.
I love that you brought up the issue of the school culture because it is something that folks have said, you want children to sit down, be quiet, um, listen, and, take in information. There have been challenges to that to say, is that what we really want for students? And that's from a systemic piece, a systemic question. That question
Hmm.
keeps coming up because we know that our students don't really thrive well in that type of environment, that they benefit from different ways of expressing themselves as they're used to at home. And so not being able to have the opportunity to do that in class also leaves them at a deficit, if you will. But not because they can't learn, right? And so these kinds of things are the types of challenges that impact ultimately their outcomes, right? If what they do and what they know for themselves don't align with what the current school culture is. So always working to try to bridge that gap, which is why we get at being able to, and we'll talk a little bit more when I get to professionals and some of the strategies that they can implement. How do we bridge that gap to get at some of those challenges? But thank you. Absolutely. I appreciate you highlighting that. Access to resources is key and hard. Both informal and formal support. Sometimes when you are a family who has not only a child with a disability, but then you also have to use Medicaid, or you might be engaging or have to use social security income as support. And so, you going through multiple systems and recognizing that you don't always know what those systems are and not having someone to navigate that with you is very challenging. But once you do have access to Medicaid, I think it's also interesting when you find out that not a lot of people accept Medicaid in the areas of specialty around disability. And so that's tough. And usually the practitioners that you're working with don't often reflect the race and ethnicity of your families. And so those things are not light at all because what they do is they're impacting the ability for families to connect with people and develop those relationships. They impact families' connection to resources and services both inside and outside the school if their family needs extra help. And so, and if you're talking about communities of color, those resources are almost little to none. Oftentimes, you have to go into other kinds of communities to access them, which means that the opportunity for um, misperceptions, assumptions, low expectations, stigma, and other things that exist around race and ethnicity in class also heighten when you have to go outside of your area in order to receive extra support and help. Sorry. But what are the strengths, right? Because that can leave us in a very down place. I will say that there is a beauty though to the tapestry, right? I always mention the tapestry because that's, I think of colors and multiple swirls and all of that good stuff. I hate to be pie in the sky, but it's helpful. Um, because we have a deep understanding of difference. And so, I remember my grandmother specifically talking about the fact that all of her children had multiple hues of brownness. And she said, our family is a rainbow. And so just off of the fact that we come into the world and we are people of color, and we understand this notion of difference almost immediately, just due to our experiences. It's a beautiful place to start from. We have a particular type of lens of how we view the world, and of course not everybody is the same, but we do have that as a strength, and I think that's important to say, and important to draw on, because we can see the difference from folks immediately. And that's a good thing, because it's okay to be different. We don't need to be the same in order to be valued. And we're a community of knowers. So through your lived experience, George Yancey uses that phrase, community of knowers. Your lived experience, you know how you can kind of walk in the room and maybe see, if you're Puerto Rican, and see another fellow Puerto Rican in the room, and y'all kind of, you talk about some food, you talk about a smell, or you talk about kind of like just knowing, right? And you don't have to do much talking, but you almost intrinsically like have this kind of, I know you, I know what's going on here. And when we talked about, in the last webinar, we talked about advocacy and leadership, and that moment when families began talking to one another and sharing their experiences. Those shared experiences essentially move you to becoming a community of knowers who, after a while, when you're in a room with families who have children with disabilities, you can share one or two stories and everybody head nods because you just know. And I think that's really valuable as a resource and a place of information and support. And we got to highlight that as a strength, because ultimately that's what moves a lot of advocacy forward. Because once we get together like that and we're strong in that knowing, we tend to move things forward and advance some of the things that might be challenges. We can work on those. Your lived experience is a powerful tool in overcoming challenges. Clearly, I'm really good at writing these slides, because when I look down at my next bullet point, I said to myself, oh, that's what I was thinking when I was sharing this. So yay, we can move on to the next slide. I think it's important for educators to remember that they have the opportunity to develop bridges of understandings with their students and families and community, and to welcome families into their students' school experience. That gets back to what you said, Gottfried, right? About this notion of school culture, some of the challenges that happen when we don't bridge the gap. Um, you will likely have stories from your home life, student teaching, or prior teaching experience of how you made connections between home and school, or how opportunities was missed. And so it's important for you as an educator, remember that point about self-reflection. I think it's really important for you to think about those moments where school went well for you, school didn't go well for you, or what you would have wished your teacher did for you, or what the student teaching leave you with. And I think that's really important in terms of self-reflection, because having that knowledge based on your own lived experience can help you see and view families' experience as they're currently experiencing it with you in a different light if we do some critical self-reflection. And so now we're moving from really talking about, in general, what's culturally responsiveness, to really talking about, so what do these things mean for families and professionals. So for professionals, I think we can all think about this, both families and professionals, but really think about your family's background. When we're doing critical self-reflection, these are some good questions. Where's your family from? Where did you grow up? What was important to your family? How would you describe your family's culture in class? What are some of the values that you've kept from your family that continue to influence who you are and who you are in school? So both in the world and in school. Think about those experiences in your life that helped you to appreciate the amazing diversity of human beings. I think that these are some questions that we don't necessarily stop and ask ourselves every day. We just kind of we're in our lived experiences, it's happening. But if you really value talking to people and getting to know people, where does that come from? If you really like quiet time by yourself, right? You don't want too many things happening. Um, you kind of like to sit down and read a book and mind your business. Where does that come from? Did you see your grandmother do that? And so that's something that you took on. Did you start doing that because you had a really chaotic family and you always needed to find a place of peace? When we do these kinds of reflections, it helps us in our conversations with one another, because you might find a student or you might find a family who is reluctant to talk to you, and so saying, you know i I understand that those things are hard, because here's something about me you could know. And we don't have to share every single piece of information, right? We always share it with. I think as we think about this and think about how we build relationships with one another, we have to ask ourselves some of these things about ourselves. Were you
Yeah.
jumping in, Godfrey?
Yeah, I just want to address one point about, and it goes back to the theme of your presentation, self-reflection.
Yeah.
That is um, an area of study that I think you may be aware of Beth Harry and a
Hmm.
professor from Syracuse University, Dr. Maya Kalyanpur. That's Klyampur. They have devised studies and a lot of good research and books about how to engage in this process of self-reflection. What are these values that I have that either make conversations with families from other cultures more difficult, or can actually make them easier, because I need to understand where I'm coming from and what my attitudes and beliefs are, so I can help address these the needs of these parents from other cultures. And I think you talked about it briefly a little while ago when you talked about culture. They have formed a technique about creating a cultural bridge between
Hmm.
different families, different groups, and have conversations about what these values are that we have that that inform our practices as parents and as teachers.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, Beth Harry. I mean, we
Yeah, she
have
is
20
awesome.
minutes. We have 20 minutes left in the webinar, but I will say, if you can do some research on Beth Harry, she's out of the University of Miami. She is an amazing scholar and researcher and has been in the field for a very long time. And she specifically talks about African American and Latino families
Yeah,
in special
right.
education and how
Yeah, she's
practitioners.
yes, excuse me. She's a professor of special ed. She's also the mother of a young woman with a disability that recently passed away.
Yes, yes. And she's a pioneer in our field. She was one of the earliest researchers to be researching families of color in special education. Um, so please, you absolutely should look her up. Gloria Ladson Billings, absolutely. Beth Harry is specifically talking about families of color who have children with disabilities. The how, the why, the systemic challenges, all of it, really good information that, if you want to know more, because again, we only have an hour today, you can certainly go and find. I'm so glad you brought her up, Godfrey. Oh my gosh.
My
I don't know
pleasure.
how I didn't quote her in this. um, but I'm glad you brought it up. And so, what does this mean for families? We talked about sharing our vision, but when we're sharing our vision, we're going to do exactly this, right? We're going to think about our family's background and values and all of that good stuff. And so, how does that impact what you envision for your child? It absolutely does. So, sometimes we have to sit with ourselves first, because you might have said to yourself, well, I didn't think about a vision for my child's life. I just want them to be, good people and in the world and be okay. But when you really start to get at it, right? I want my son to know about history, and I want him to know about music, and especially like hip hop and R&B and B and all of these things that are really important to me. Music was so key for my family. And so with him having Down syndrome, though, I had to think about, how am I going to teach these things to him, because he learns a little bit differently and he processes differently. So I might not necessarily teach it to him in the way that it was taught to me. I need to think about other ways, but I still have the end result of wanting him to share in my family values around kind of our history as Black people in this country and as a music lover. So we might have a different path, but I still want him to get there because that's deeply entrenched in my culture. But I had to think about that. I had to think about that. And I think, sitting and reflecting on that is really important to being able to share your vision because you got to be able to define it. And once you do that, you get to tell your stories. So, and we always said we use our narratives in specific ways. When you share your expectations of school according to your family values, you might have a family situation where your culture is you're kind of like, I get my kiddos to school every day. I'm not coming out to PTO and all of that good stuff. My values around that is my expectation is that as a parent, I get my child to school. Period. I pick them up on time. That's what I'm supposed to do. You guys have them for the 8 hours, or you have them during the time they're at preschool. I've done my job, please do your job. Nobody's saying there is no judgment about whether that's right or wrong, right? That's where we got to suspend judgment. It just is an expectation that people have. And so if someone asks you as to why you're not in school all the time, you can share that expectation with them, that this is what I do and then this is what you do, so that they know where you're coming from. That's just one example of many. Share books and resources as families that tell your therapists and teachers about your culture and background. Sometimes people don't know what they don't know. And if their own experience has been in a very segregated community, and I know when we say segregation, it conjures up a connotation that is negative, but we don't all live together in these really diverse communities all the time. So people don't know what they don't know. And so you have to share information in order for them to know. Go ahead, Jackie. Oh, are you on mute? Okay. So ask if the curriculum will include stories that are diverse and if they include disability, because you want to make sure your children are reflected
Hello?
in the things that are being shared with them.
No, no.
Whoever is off mute, we can hear you.
Say it again.
Milka?
Hold on.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Talana.
No problem. You're off. Your mic is on.
Yes, I know. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Thank you.
No problem. Invite staff to community events. If you know your neighborhood is having a barbecue or a block party or something like that, let your children's teachers know so that they can see their students in a setting outside of school, so that you can have an opportunity to have a conversation that's not so, when you're in the school building talking to your teachers and educators and principals, it's kind of hard to talk about your everyday, right? And folks they have their own lives outside of their own profession, and so it would be good to see them in some jeans and sneakers at the block party, right, if that's the case. But invite them. It creates opportunities to build and develop relationships that will only serve to have great outcomes for your children in the long run and for other children, right? Because we're talking about us as families and leadership, and so that creates opportunities to see other families as well. If something is challenging, as always, please use your due process rights. It is important to write that letter and send an email and make the system take note of how things are challenging for families of color who have children with disabilities. If you never write the letter, if you only call, if you never send an email, or you just get really frustrated about what happens and don't tell anybody, it's harder to change things. Because then folks like us who sit in leadership positions, you know what we hear? We hear, well, nobody is telling us that. That's not what we're hearing. Or we haven't heard about that issue yet. And so I always implore families to make sure that you use your due process rights and you do write down letters and let people know what's going on with you and where in the system you find things challenging. And again, it's as simple as writing your story, but it's important that you do. So for professionals, we need to think about the practices, right? that respect and acknowledge the cultural uniqueness, life experiences, and viewpoints of classroom families. So what does this mean for professionals? It means we need to build relationships. And I think that's what we talked about. We talked about being self-reflective, and we talked about being self-reflective so that when you encounter new cultural identities, you can be able to build those relationships and bridge the gap wherever they exist. Be present, right? Be present in the community. So if I'm going to tell families to invite folks, I'm going to tell educators to go head out in the community, okay? You get a chance to see your families in different ways. And they're built on relationships. I can't stress that enough. And the only way we get to do that is if we're around one another. So always start with a conversation. Keep it connected to the child's learning and the outcome, right? And listen, right? These conversations can happen both at the school or in the community. And like I said, enjoy neighborhood walks, go to a porch visit, a less intrusive form. You don't have to go into somebody's house to do a house visit. You can sit outside, right, and talk to families, and that way they don't necessarily feel like you're checking on them. I think these are key pieces. Identify and use what works for families. When working with diverse families, if we're going to talk about individualized plans, then we're going to say that one family is one family. One family, one family. And all that it is about them, but you will never know all that it is about them, right? And so you're always in learning mode. You're a learner yourself. And so again, not being present for school-based family events doesn't mean that a child's family isn't engaged in student learning. I am not interested in often going to the school half the time. Tell me what to do and I will do it. I'll make sure he does his homework. I'll make sure he has the things that he needs for school in the morning. But I am not the volunteer family person. That's my sister. She loves to volunteer at school. That's her jam. It's not my jam. And we come from the same family. But we have different ways of doing it. But we don't look at it as a deficit. We just look at it as different ways of doing it, right? And so as long as you ask questions of families, then you'll know what ways to better engage them depending on the type of what type of person they are. But you have to talk to them. You have to ask these kinds of questions. So partner with families to co-plan a school-based event or co-design a home-based family activity. So, maybe coming up with something that the family could do at home that relates to something at school. And there we're talking about two different types of families, but both different ways of kind of using what it is that they do versus what it is that we want them to do as professionals. I mentioned us being a community of knowers, so that means that professionals would have to recognize and honor and promote existing knowledge. This is the key to this is the undergird of when we say families are partners, this is important. And so all families have knowledge and many are willing to share. One, we got to come to understand what families know, which means you have to ask. And then when they do share it, we have to honor it, right? So we have to create spaces for them to share it with the class, share it with the school, honor and value when they're telling us a story that's even hard for us to hear because it may be about us as well. And finally, by promoting it. So engaging students, other families, and additional school personnel, sharing information. And when you do that, it sends a clear message to all the families that they are valued and that they matter. So invite linguistically diverse families to teach or share their primary language. That doesn't mean censor them in a way that feels uncomfortable for them. But if you ask and they want to, create that space for them to do so. Have different families assist you with purchasing books for the school. Could you imagine if you're serving Latino families and you to think about what books should we read this year that could talk about some things that reflect your culture? My goodness, the buy-in that you would have from families would be amazing. And we know that curriculum is a broad set. So sometimes we say, oh, we can't do that based on the curriculum. That's what we hear oftentimes. And no, I think there is some flexibility. And if you said it from this place of trying to be culturally responsive, I think we really could reimagine what those curriculums look like if they're not already included. But asking families this kind of question, my goodness, the buy-in, I tell you, I think about it. We could really reimagine doing things differently if we had this as a sense, as a core of the work that we do. Promoting a culture of awareness, learning, and sharing. The key to this is about listening and observing, right? So we're saying we're doing self-reflection. We're asking questions of ourselves. We're asking questions of families. But then you actually have to listen. So that means you have to be quiet. You can't be talking and doing at the same time that you're looking and listening. Um, and it's because we rob ourselves of the opportunity to examine and challenge our preconceived notion. When we're already talking and acting, our minds are moving in a different way. When we're listening and observing, it's quieter up there, and we actually get to hear some of our own things about what we already thought about families. But when you really begin to look at the fact that, say, a family doesn't have a coat for their child, or the child is coming in and they're not really, the clothes are torn and tattered, and for once, you say to yourself, God, this child doesn't have this and this child doesn't have that because they live in this area and that's just a poor area. No, that's not always the case. Maybe, right, if we really look and listen, maybe something is happening on their way to school. Maybe something is happening on their bus. Maybe somebody is taking their stuff. Maybe they don't, it could be lots of different things. But if we don't ever really look and observe and see what's happening, then our record players of our mind, where we get these other assumptions about people, start to play and take over when we just go ahead and talk and act. So we have to quiet it. We have to quiet it because sometimes we can be potentially offensive, and we don't necessarily mean to be, but it happens when we're not taking the time to promote a culture of awareness by learning and sharing and listening and observing. So, what can we do? Host storytelling. If I'm telling families to share their stories, imagine if practitioners were hosting a storytelling and listening group where teachers and families can talk about their personal experiences. This would be some deeply connected group of people, right? If we talk about reading groups or maybe watch a movie together where you're talking about really breaking down bias, understanding of culture, and getting to the issue at hand, putting things on the table so that you actually really get to move things forward and break down some barriers. Building social capital, I cannot stress this enough. I said it already. Vibrant and resilient communities are founded on the idea that we're in this together. That is so key. So building social capital among parents is particularly important to education because working class parents, unlike their middle class counterparts, are not typically connected to each other around schools. The work day and all of that good stuff gets in the way of them having the ability to connect to schools during the times that engagement usually happens. And so host some events that are centered on relationship building, both on and off school property, so that everyone can connect to the surrounding community. Go to a place that you know a lot of people go to. Create a knowledge sharing board. There's so many ideas that you really could get at to really connect and really build the knowledge that you share across groups, because we're trying to get at, once again, coming together to move things along for children's academic outcome and knock down some of the barriers that we mentioned at the beginning for families who have children with disabilities of color. So I'm going to end where I started. It's necessary for you to engage in critical self-reflection to uncover your implicit personal biases, assumptions, and bridge across understanding their cultural groups. Whether subconscious or explicit, your negative perceptions about children impact your ability to teach them, and it also impacts their outcome. And so you got to question, what are your initial reactions to the child and their family? What do your reactions tell you about your own personal beliefs and assumptions? What can you do to build trust? That is how we will move forward. And you must be able to sit with yourself and know what your beliefs and assumptions are to actually answer that question. So it felt like a marathon. It felt like a sprint, but this is just the beginning of the marathon. I appreciate your time and attention today. I know we normally say we'll debrief and have questions and answers. We started at 12:05, so we usually try to go until 1:05. So if somebody has any questions inside the chat, because I'm not able to see it, we usually have them read out loud. I would be happy to answer. Do we have any questions? I thank you for your time and attention today and listening to me. I appreciate the opportunity. And Milka, as always, thank you for your assistance with IT. And Godfrey, thank you for your great points and
You're welcome.
sharing and information today.
We
Do we
do
have any
have some
Q&A?
questions.
Oh, great.
Awesome.
It says regarding the underserved Black Latino children, I'm glad this information is being addressed. I covered Queens for 17 years, and most of my advocacy work was in regards to making sure providers serve south of Hillside Avenue. Can you state the name of the article again?
Sure. Let me go. I'm sorry. Hold on. I'm gonna stop showing my screen for a minute so I can go to the article.
Mhm.
Um,
And while you're doing that, Talana,
yes.
perhaps I can offer another recommendation to the question asker.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Beth Harry wrote a book a number of years ago that's still considered a to-do book. It's called "Why Are There So Many Minority Children in Special Education?" And she addresses many of the points that were covered in today's presentation, and also offers some ideas as to how we can bridge that gap and create um, platforms where competing cultures can have chance to develop understandings of their beliefs and customs, just so we can offer better programs and opportunities for our children.
I
Um,
absolutely love that book.
Yeah, it's a
I'm
great.
still looking up the article, but if we could go to another question, I'll get back to it.
yes,
Oh,
I was
okay,
just
got
about
it.
to start reading.
I
Okay.
was gonna say I got it. It's on chalkbeat.org.
What? Say that again.
Chalkbeat.org.
Uh, escalator.
And it's
So
about provider shortages.
there's another question that says, can you please restate and spell the name of the researcher? Is it Beth Harry?
Yes, Beth Beth Harry Harry. And I think I'm showing the name of the website right now.
Chalk. Right.
Can you see it?
Yeah, we
Yes.
have it.
Okay.
Then someone asked regarding the PowerPoint. We will be sharing and we will notify everyone when it's ready to be shared. And that's about all the questions that came in.
Okay. Well, I thank everyone for sticking with us. Thank you for listening. I look forward to if anyone has any questions, you can certainly follow up with anybody at Sinergia or myself. I forget to put down my email information, but it is TalanaJones32 at Gmail. If you have other questions to ask me, I would be happy to answer. Thank you for your time and
Okay.
attention today. I appreciate everyone's listening in, and thank you, Sinergia, for allowing me to share this information with families and professionals.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Talana. Take care.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.